Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and in this lesson I'll cover how to create this swirling particle effect using Trapcode Particular. Mostly what we'll be studying are the emitter and particle sections, but I'll introduce a couple new topics to get us moving forward into different areas of Trapcode Particular. So let's get started and create a new composition for a particle swirl. I'll be working at 1280 by 720 at 24 frames per second. Now I'm going to drop a composition that has some type in it. This is simply some After Effects type. That's a 2D layer, and I put a little bit of color on it using the ramp effect. So it starts at white and has a little bit of an orange tint towards the bottom. This type composition is in After Effects, and I'm going to make this a 3D layer. Next, I'll create a camera, as well as a solid to use Trapcode Particular. Make this the size of the comp, and I like to use black for my particle effects. I'm going to call this Particular 1 because I'll be using a number of different particle effects layered together. Now to do this, I'm going to be using a light emitter. So in my emitter section here, my default emitter type is point. And this emits particles from a single point in space that we can manually locate using the X, Y, and Z controls right here. But a much easier way to locate things in 3D space is to use a light. So I'm going to go up here to Layer New Light, make this a point light, and leave everything else at the default settings, intensity of 100, and the color really doesn't matter right now because I won't be using the color from lights. But I do want to change the name here, and I'm going to call this Emitter. Now one thing you're going to notice is that this light should be affecting the text. That's exactly what it should be doing by default, but we probably don't want this because it's going to be moving up and down, back and forth in front of the text and behind the text. So rather than have that sort of flickering effect, I'm going to have this light not affect the text. And I'll do this by going to the light layer, clicking on the adjustment layer switch, and moving this below the type layer. Because adjustment layers only affect the layers below in the stacking order, this will not affect the type because it's below the type. Next thing I'm going to do is create a null object, and I'll use this to parent the light to that, and as I rotate it, it will create that swirling effect. So I'll just call this the light null. I want to make this 3D as well, and I will parent the light to the null. I'm not seeing my parenting columns here, so I can just right click up in the header, go to columns, and select parent towards there at the bottom. So down here in the parenting column, I can select this little pick whip and target the light null. Now as I move the null, the light will move along with it relative to how the light moves. What I'm going to do is show my position for the light and set this to 0, 0, and 0. So what that'll do, because it's parented, is put it exactly where the null is. And then I'm going to move the light up just a little bit. So what's going to happen now is that as I rotate this null along the x-axis, it will create sort of a orbiting kind of effect. It'll take along a circular path. Now in my particular settings, I'll go to the emitter type, set this to lights, and because I have this light named emitter, it will emit particles at that point in space. In fact, if I create multiple lights, it will emit from all of the lights in my scene that match the name in my options here. Any light that starts with the word emitter will be used as a particle emitter. If I want to change this name, I can do that, but I'm just going to leave that at emitter. So let's set up our basic motion path here. Let's move this null over. I'll show my position by hitting P and rewind to the beginning. I'll set a keyframe for that position, and then over the course of 3 seconds, I'll move this over to the right. About 1 second before that keyframe, so that would be the 2-second mark, I'll set a keyframe for my light emitter, And then what I'll do is move this down so this light will take a motion path that moves towards where the null is. So now I just need to do the rotating motion here. So I'll set a keyframe for the X rotation, and then at 3 seconds I'll set this to maybe 4 even rotations. I'll also hit F9 to ease that in. Now you can see a little bit of a circular path, but what's happening is because our velocity has a velocity from motion setting, it is inheriting the velocity of the emitter. So particular is looking at how fast this light is moving, and currently it's inheriting 20% of that motion. I'm going to set this to 0 so that it has no motion from the emitter. However, they're still moving because I have a velocity of 100. I'll also set that to 0. They're still not in a perfect path, although they're not moving. The reason that they are not in a perfect line is because I have an emitter size of 50 by 50 by 50 around the location of the light. So if I zero that out, we should have a pretty straight line. Now I'll go up to the particles per second to sort of fill this in. Kind of getting there, but if you look down here at the bottom, we can see things look a little bit jagged. Now it's doing exactly what we're telling it to do because it is drawing a line that is created by the path on each frame. However, there's a little bit of a shortcoming here, even though we're drawing a path that is created at each frame. So what we should be able to do is subsample this path and smooth it out. And what we can do is go into the position subframe settings and set this to something that is not the linear setting that we have right now. Generally, 10x linear should take care of it unless it's moving very fast, and then we might need something like 10x smooth or even exact. 10x linear should be pretty good. So now we have the basic path here. Now to get the camera motion that I showed you in the original, the easiest way to do this is to parent the camera to a null object as well. So by creating another null, I'm going to rename this cam null just to keep my nulls organized. I'll parent the camera to the null. Now if I simply rotate the null, I can get a very easy pivoting motion of the camera. So this is where the camera is going to end, right here at 0 degrees in the Y rotation. So I'll start it out right here at 90. I'll also select that, F9 to ease in the camera move. There we go. So mostly what we have is the motion path for the particles, but we haven't really done anything to the look of the particles themselves. I've just kind of set up the basic settings here with the camera move and the motion path of the particles. So let's get into how to tweak the particle types here. Now the first one I'm going to set up here, in particular number 1, is going to be kind of a light streak setting. So we're good with the emitter. We've got all of our emitter settings all set. Now I need to tweak the look of the particle. I'm going to use streaklet. Now I'm going to need to size this up so you can see what's going on in here. So let me go to the particle size and turn this up to 25. And down in the streaklet settings, I'll turn the streaklet size down to 20. So the streaklet, as you can see, is essentially a cluster of different sized circles that all draw on together that sort of look like light streaks. So I can change the number of streaks by going into the number of streaks parameter here. I'll leave this set to 7. There's also a random seed for the light streaks in here, so it will change the randomness of the light streaks. Next I'll go to the color and we'll set this to maybe something kind of bright orange. But notice that the color is looking kind of flat. It's basically a solid color. Generally, light streaks have a very kind of overexposed look to them. And we can do this by lowering the opacity just a little bit and going to the transfer mode, which is how the particles blend their colors with each other when they overlap. And I'll set this to something like add. Now in these overlapping sections, we get this overexposed kind of look because I've lowered the opacity and we've blended the particles together a little bit. The reason I lowered the opacity is when you have overlapping particles like this, it can get a little bit hot in those overlapping areas. So I think it's a good idea to go in and start lowering the opacity just a little bit. Even though we're using streaklets, we still have size over life control. So I can scale it up so that as the particles draw on, the streaklets will scale up, and they can also scale down as they come to the end of their life cycle. So over here at the end, if I start lowering my life span of the particles, you'll see that the streaklet starts to scale down in size. Now, in a previous tutorial, I spoke about how After Effects doesn't have a unified 3D space between its 3D layers and its 3D effects. And as you can see, even though my light is going behind the text, and I know that because I can see at this initial frame, I've got my null object and the light right here, and they start to rotate, and they clearly go all the way around the text. So it goes in front and behind the text. But all of my particles appear to be in front of the text. Because as I mentioned, there's no unified 3D space between the 3D layers and the 3D effects. Particular does have a little bit of a workaround, and we're going to jump to one of the later sections down here, which is the visibility section. We have an obscuration layer. So we can define one layer that will obscure these particles. And what Trapcode Particular is going to do is keep track of this layer, where it is, where its visibility is, or its alpha channel, sample where that layer should be and which particles should be obscured by that, and internally within the plugin make those particles invisible. Now that's a mouthful. All we really need to do is go to Obscuration Layer and select the layer we'd like to obscure. Make sure it is a 3D layer, and also if you're using a type layer, make sure it is pre-composed like I've done here. Otherwise, you'll run into errors. So I'll select that type layer, and now where particles were in front of it but should be behind, as you can see on the top of the P and on the A here, the particles go behind the text. This other setting here, also obscure with, you might think, hey, well that gives me two layers. But actually what this does is interact with floor and wall layers that we have available to us in the physics section. And we're not going to be covering that today. So now that I've got all my effects in place, I can simply start duplicating these layers and layering effects on top of each other. So instead of using a streaky kind of effect, I will go back to the particle section, and let's use a sphere, and I'll set the life to a very short lifespan, so it'll be limited to just the front part of the path. Let's go into the emitter section and lower that to a much smaller value. And I think I'm going to use something more like this, where we have kind of a larger particle at the beginning and smaller particle at the end. And actually, let's go in here and smooth that out just a little bit. In fact, I can just click on this one right here and use that. So let's scale up the size here. And maybe we want to vary the color just a little bit. So next, let's add some trailing particles that sort of deviate from this path here. So I'm going to duplicate this again, and we'll stick with spheres. Let's push the lifespan out to about 1 second, but turn the size down to 10, and go up to the emitter and turn up the velocity so that they start to move away from their main motion path. In fact, I'm going to turn the particles per second up quite high to maybe 1,000 per second, maybe even 2,000. So I'm going to want a pretty small particle here. I just want sort of a, almost like a pixie dust effect. Maybe I'll settle on about 5. Now, even though I've set the internal blending mode of these particles to add, one thing you're often going to want to do is set the layer blending mode to a different blending mode. So as you can see, the small particles are nicely blending with each other, but the layers themselves are not blending with each other. And this is handled by the composition itself. So I'm going to go to this layer, particle layer number 3, maybe set this to screen so that they blend together quite nicely. Now I'm going to add another layer here, and I'll change this particle type to star. And I'll turn this size up to maybe 8 and change the color to maybe something a little bit more red, between red and purple. Now I'm going to solo these 2 layers, and let's take a look here. If I turn particular layer 4 off, and we can see where it overlaps with 3, you can see that because I've duplicated these and they have the same particle count, that they are in the exact same spots. The particles are all in the exact same locations. This is because particle generators and many things in computer graphics in general are not exactly random. This is something that is very common in computer graphics, where things that seem to be random really aren't. They're using predefined lists of what we perceive to be random numbers. This is done using what we call a random seed. So it's basically a starting point. This is the initial value, or just some arbitrary value that's used to change the list of numbers that are used to define all the randomness that is happening, such as their velocities and angles that the particles are randomly choosing when they're born. So I can simply mix this up by choosing a different random seed for my second layer. So now if I solo these 2 layers, you can see that the spheres and stars are occupying different spots in space. They have different velocities, different angles that are being used by the emitter. Now in layer number 4, these stars are a little bit hefty, so I'm going to go in and lower the lifespan down to maybe half a second and take the opacity down to a pretty low value like 20. Okay, I'm going to duplicate this one more time because I'd like to introduce just a little bit of the physics section to you. So let me solo this layer. Now I'm going to set this particle type back to a sphere, and maybe we'll do something that's a little bit lighter of a color. So I want sort of a smoky pixie dust, fairy dust kind of thing, and we're really only going to achieve this effect with a very high particle count rather than filling an area with sort of these large smoky particles. So normally I'd set this to 1, but in terms of the tutorial screen capture here, I think we're going to have to go with about 2. I'm going to raise the lifespan to about 1.5, and I'm going to go to the emitter and set this to a pretty high value. I'm going to use a value of 50,000. So now you can kind of see almost this pixie dust kind of look. Now my problem with this is that it looks almost too perfect. We have particles moving along this swirly path, but it doesn't feel natural because as these particles are moving in space, they should sort of dissipate and do something other than kind of drift along this perfect spiral path. There should be wind and turbulence and other things that kind of push our particles around. And that's exactly what I'm going to use. I'm going to use the turbulence feature in physics. Now, when I twirl physics open, you might get overwhelmed with the fact that we've got all these air settings and bounce settings and all that. But keep this in mind. We can only use one physics model at a time. I can either use air physics, which includes wind, turbulence, that kind of thing, or I can use bounce physics, which allows particles to bounce and react with After Effects layers. I can only use one at a time, so even though you see these 2 sections that are fairly complicated, know that we can only use one at a time. There's only two parameters that are common between both. There's gravity, which causes particles to accelerate downward or even upward if we set it to a negative value, and physics time factor, which is an overall speed throttle that we can use to control the entire universe within Trapcode particular on this one layer. We're not going to be using either of those right now because we're not going in depth into physics. I just want to show you one very handy setting, which is air turbulence. Turbulence uses fractal noise, 3D fractal noise, which looks exactly like you might think if you've ever used fractal noise before. Fractal noise is layers of noise on top of each other that start with a very large noise, and then as we layer more and more noise on top of each other, the noise gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and we get these little detailed areas of noise. So we get these large pockets of dark areas and light areas, and we get these little detailed areas. And this is all achieved by just laying noise on top of each other. Now, in terms of Trapcode particular, this exists in 3D space. You can kind of think of it like a fog that you would walk through. So if we use this as a map, dark areas could push it one way, light areas could push it the opposite way. Gray areas would leave the particles unaffected. So taking into consideration this turbulence field, and basically it exists, you just don't see it. You don't see the actual map, but we can see its effects. So I can have that map affect the size of the particles, which I'm not going to do. I'm going to have it affect the positions of the particles. So I'll set this to maybe to 150, and as you can see over time, these particles will start to sort of take on almost a smoky kind of feel. Now, the fractal field or turbulence isn't going to affect the particles till 1/2 second after their birth. I can set this to a much lower value to start affecting them even sooner. Now you can start to see that sort of smoky nature of the particles. So let's unsolo that. And looks like I've got too much of the stars, or maybe the star particles are just the wrong color. So let's close everything up here. Let's go to the particle section and pick something that fits in just a little bit better. There, that feels better. And for this last layer, let's go in here and warm that up just a little bit. It doesn't seem to be fitting perfectly well. Okay, so to wrap things up here, I probably would want to have just a fewer number of full rotations so that things don't move quite so fast. Also, at the end, we've never actually animated our particles per second to stop them from emitting. So they're just going to sit there and keep emitting particles. Now, there's two ways I could do this. I can go to each layer and animate the particles per second in the emitter section. But there's actually a much easier way to do this. You notice right here in the emitter section we have a particles per second modifier which defaults to the light intensity. All of my layers have this because they're all set to the default setting of this light intensity. So what that means is they're following this light, and the light intensity is a modifier for the particles per second. So all 5 layers that I've created, I can simply go into my emitter, tap AA to show my light options, and in the intensity here, I can keyframe this from 100% down to 0. So let's do a quick preview here. So here's the render. A basic set of particles that swirls around some text, obscured by the text, but lots of different layers of particle looks in there. We've got streaks and stars and spheres and a little bit of fractal noise. So I hope this gives you a better understanding of particular, mainly using the emitter and particle sections, and then introducing the concept of physics and a little bit of the visibility section too. So my name's Harry Frank. Thank you so much for watching.